On this day, December the 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Imperial Japan. The day prior, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack against the United States Pacific Fleet, which was anchored at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. That attack, while there were some rumors and intelligence suggesting that it would come, shocked the nation. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. And that one singular event, 84 years ago, thrusted the once isolationist and nominally neutral North American behemoth into what was now being rightly considered World War II. The United States ultimately joined forces with the other Allied powers, Great Britain and the Soviet Union. And it is often noted in history that the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was followed up by attacks on the Philippines, Hong Kong, the Malayan Peninsula, today Malaysia, and other Western European and United States colonial outposts throughout the Pacific. It was celebrated by then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, not for the lives lost or the fact that this had occurred in such a swift and brutal fashion that ultimately the British Empire in Asia would suffer long term as a result. But it was a moment to celebrate because the United States was now firmly in the column of the Allies, and Churchill's efforts in order to make that a reality finally paid off, albeit without his direct involvement, meaning that he had no role to play in Pearl Harbor itself. He was a beneficiary of it from the standpoint of creating what he dubbed the Grand Alliance. And that was because for about a year, from 1940 to 1941, Britain was alone in their fight against Nazi Germany, the Axis in general, but Nazi Germany in specific. And it was only in June of 1941 when Nazi Germany launched its own surprise attack against the Soviet Union that Britain finally had an ally in their fight against tyranny. To be fair, the ally was one that certainly rivaled Nazi Germany with respect to its terror and dictatorial style of government and control over the entire population, and certainly the genocidal urges of its leader, Joseph Stalin, but it was an ally nonetheless. And it was only after Pearl Harbor that Winston Churchill knew that this titanic struggle would ultimately be won by the Allies. It would be a long time until that occurred, But eventually, at some point in the future, the Allies would be victorious. And that wasn't the case in July of 1940, which Churchill no doubt had in the back of his mind, and he used that as sort of a motivational reminder to how bad things can really get. By that time, World War II had been going on for almost 1 year. Nazi Germany launched their invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, which ultimately led to France and Great Britain reciprocating and declaring war against Nazi Germany. But those declarations were relatively hollow. Poland was invaded, defeated, and subjugated by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union within a month. There was some resistance for more than a month, and obviously the partisan movement within Poland itself would be one of the longest running and most organized in all of Europe. But for all intents and purposes, Poland, in its capacity as an independent, sovereign state, was not able to survive the onslaught of the Nazis and Soviets. In April the following year, after a brief interlude dubbed the Phony War, Nazi Germany struck again, this time aimed at conquering Scandinavia and the Nordic nations of Denmark and Norway. Finland was a relatively, I guess you could say, fence straddler. They had their disagreements with the Soviets, who were allied with the Nazis at this time. But they also were, in a lot of ways, similar to and had a lot of friendly overtures diplomatically, economically, militarily with Nazi Germany. So they were not considered a threat to the Nazis. Sweden, neutral, much like Switzerland, had no intention of getting involved, as is often the case with that nation's history. Norway was seen as a target ripe for the picking and also crucial in order to prevent a World War I style blockade of the Baltics, in which the then German Empire suffered with their brutal starvations during the turnip winters and the winter of 1917 and 18. So, in order to prevent that, the Nazis launched a preventative operation against Norway. And that's the first time that the British and French and the Germans met on the field of battle. And as would be the case for the first half of 1940, the Allies were dealt a severe defeat, especially at the Arctic port of Narvik. The ultimate German victory in Norway forced a humiliating evacuation and retreat by the British and the French. And it ultimately led to grumblings within Great Britain to remove or to have a display of no confidence against then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He, of course, was the Prime Minister who oversaw the meetup in Munich between himself and Hitler, and he declared when he arrived back in Great Britain following that meeting that he had, in his capacity as the prime minister, in meeting with Hitler, he had declared peace for our time. And he said that on September 30th, 1938, following the Munich Agreement and subsequent Anglo-German declaration. Of course, a year later, the world was at war, and indeed peace was not secured for their time. So his position within the British government and the support within his own party even was starting to dissipate. And eventually, indeed, he would ultimately resign in his capacity as prime minister on May 10th, 1940. Now, that date coincided, rather coincidentally, with Nazi Germany's planned invasion of the Low Countries and France. Low Countries being Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. At the time, France had the Maginot Line, which was a series of defensive fortifications, bunkers, pillboxes, and other supporting armaments that ran from the Franco-Swiss border all the way to that of the Low Countries. And the idea was, in the event that there was a future conflict between France and Germany, the French would be in an ideal position to repel any German offensive operations. And that was largely the mentality and mindset that had been developed following World War I. World War I being known famously for trench warfare, static fighting, and misery and gloom for anyone who experienced it. But initially, in the early stages in 1914, there were offensive operations conducted by both sides. And in fact, the Germans at one point were in a very strategically advantageous position to capture Paris. Ultimately, that did not happen, and the resulting effect of that was the establishment of trench warfare. So, to prevent that misery, pain, and suffering, especially for France, who suffered the lion's share of the casualties for the Allies, losing roughly 16% of its conscripted male population, they decided, on their own initiative, to build this defensive bulwark with the guns facing Germany. The ultimate goal being to have peace through strength, to create such a large and formidable fortification, a French fortress, if you will, that would give Germany a moment of pause to consider and reflect their actions before deciding whether or not it would be ideal to get involved with a skirmish against France. And certainly the Germans did have that moment of pause, but it was not to consider whether or not to invade France. It was a decision as to where would be the most ideal place to do so. And initially they had plans that were very similar to the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was the one initiated in 1914, in which the German armies would march down in almost like a swinging door type fashion, and the famous motive of the Schlieffen Plan would be that the German soldier on the farthest right side of the advance would brush his sleeve against the channel. And what that basically meant was, in throwing the entirety of Germany's military against the enemy, they would form a line of attack in which the last man on the right would brush the channel with his sleeve, such that there would be a front that would be too long for the French to battle against, or would be too massive to contain. And that was a similar plan that was drawn up in 1939 and 1940. Not to the same specifications. After all, World War II did introduce on a large scale the idea of armored warfare. You had some of it in World War I, but not to the same degree, certainly in World War II. And as a result, the plans had to be tailor-made for the incorporation of armored and vehicular warfare. However, that plan was ultimately shanghaied because a reconnaissance aircraft carrying the plane was shot down and the plans themselves were recovered. And when that happened, there was, you could say, a moment of panic within the German high command, but they had to sort of take a moment to reconsider things and whether or not it would be best to continue moving forward. And it was Erich von Manstein who would ultimately come up with a plan to find a way to replace the initial operation plan and still ensure success for the Germans. And that would come in the form of and again, this is going to be a real butchering of the German language, trying to pronounce this, but it would be an operation known as the Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut in Germany. And it called for an attack through the woods of the Ardennes, which were in Belgium and Luxembourg, and advance towards the English Channel, thereby cutting off the French and British forces that had now moved up to the border of Belgium after having discovered the plans for Germany's invasion. And that was considered bold and risky because of the fact that the Ardennes was a thickly wooded area, and it was thought by both the Allies and the Axis to be completely incompatible for armored warfare, and that tanks and trucks and other vehicles would not be able to traverse the Ardennes. Manstein decided to take a gamble. He rolled the dice, and his plan was ultimately approved. And on May 10th, that plan was put into action. And it succeeded beyond even the most positive expectations. Everyone's concept of what was going to occur with this German assault against France was blown out of the water. The Ardennes was sparsely defended, and the Germans were able to not only advance through it and thus begin the drive to cut off the French and British forces that were now to the north of them, but they also were able to skirt around the Maginot Line, thereby making it useless and redundant. And it's interesting to note all the many billions of French francs that went into its creation, construction, and ultimately it was all for naught. It was never utilized in the intended purposes that France wanted it to be. And that was really the genius of Manstein specifically, but the German operational plan as a whole. And as a result, the British and French were sent reeling. They attempted to try and outmaneuver the Germans as their rear was slowly closed in on them. And ultimately, they had no choice but to retreat to the Channel ports, Dunkirk, Boulogne, Calais. And from there, they had to hold out either until destruction, surrender, or if there could be any hope, a miracle. And that miracle came in the form of Operation Dynamo, which was the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force and French soldiers, more than 335,000, from Dunkirk to Great Britain. And that occurred over the span of 8 days, May 26th to June 4th, 1940. And that pivotal evacuation plan, which was supported heavily by the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who for years and years and years had been drawing attention to the rising and mounting threat that Nazi Germany posed to the rest of Europe and certainly to the rest of the world. And it was his boldness and his swift action that ultimately put Operation Dynamo in effect. And it was the even swifter action of the British, Canadian Royal Navies, as well as the British Army and Air Force, to act on those orders. And this was only his 16th day as Prime Minister when he had to give the okay on this operation. And it was extremely risky. And there was also internal strife over whether or not Winston Churchill was the best person to represent Great Britain in this hour of need. And that was because he was not a party faithful. The Conservatives, who were the majority in government at the time, were very skeptical because he had one point been in their party, then had left to join the Liberal Party and was now back. So his chameleon-like ability to bounce around and go from one party to the other, based solely upon the growing popular tide and sentiment on certain issues, caused many, including Chamberlain and Lord Halifax, to be skeptical of Churchill. However, it was without a doubt, certainly after this point, that Churchill was the best person suited to lead Great Britain during this darkest hour. However, Operation Dynamo was probably the only silver lining in this darkest cloud that was the Nazi invasion of Western Europe. Within 6 weeks of the German advance to the Ardennes, France capitulated, and they had signed the surrender instrument that officially carved France in two, the Germans occupying the north and the Vichy collaborationist regime occupying the south. The document was signed in the same railway car that had been utilized to end World War I. And it's sort of, I guess you could say, coincidence. Certainly wasn't. That was Hitler's goal in utilizing that railway car. But it was also the irony that the former defeated power was now subjugating the once proud victor. And that surrender came on June 22nd, 1940. So for an entire calendar year, to the very day, Britain was now alone. And by July of 1940, Hitler had set his sights on conquering that small last hope island across the channel. But in order to do that, he had to have control, or at least nominal superiority, against either the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, or both. Ideally, if the Royal Air Force could be subdued, the German Luftwaffe would be able to provide fighter support and bombing against the Royal Navy, which at that time was the largest, most sophisticated, and certainly the best navy in the world, which would inevitably come to the aid of the mother island as the German invasion craft began to cross the channel. And as would be the case, the year later in the Pacific, when the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse were both sunk on December 10th by Japanese-based aircraft, land-based aircraft. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers, and even aircraft carriers, if they were unprotected, were virtually worthless against airplanes. So in order to ensure that the invasion would go on as planned and that the invasion troops would have support, the Royal Air Force had to be destroyed. That was the sole obstacle in the way between Hitler and the mastery of Europe. And the subsequent Battle of Britain that would take place from July of 1940 until, some would say, October of that same year, Halloween. It would really continue throughout the entire war because you had continuous German bombing, that occurred into 1941. As the war progressed and it was clear that Germany was going to lose, they desperately tried any sort of attempt to unnerve the morale of the British population through the launch of V 1 and V 2 unmanned rockets. So the Battle of Britain was a multi year affair, but the famous and well known aerial combat Battle of Britain occurred between July and October of 1940. And it is that battle, that crucial, crucial event that occurred above the skies of the only remaining free and liberty prospering democracy in Europe, that this episode will focus on. And it will be told through two books that are able to take the reader into the mind of the commanders on both sides, the civilians, but ultimately the pilots in the cockpits and their supporting staff, mechanics, fuel suppliers, ammunition resuppliers, and it is quite a fascinating story. And the first book, Taking London by Martin Dugard, focuses on how the battle itself could best be viewed through individuals and how they contributed before, during, and even after the battle itself into shaping the ultimate outcome for Great Britain. And one of the key individuals who really was instrumental, though he certainly did not receive credit at the time, for making sure that Britain was adequately prepared for an inevitable Second World War, was R.J. Mitchell, or his full name was Reginald Joseph Reg Mitchell, Reg being his nickname. And he was a sort of British Howard Hughes from the standpoint of being a very sophisticated and a very thorough engineer. He knew his stuff and he knew it extremely well. And he was able to take his talents as an engineer working for Supermarine, which was actually a predominantly seaplane producing aircraft company, and apply it towards creating what many considered at the time, and you could certainly make the argument now, one of the most sleek and aesthetically beautiful yet efficient and superb aircraft ever. And as Dugard writes, he was able to do it, and to do it in a way that defied expectations. Quote, were he not alone, I.J. Mitchell might also talk at length about the concentric square tubing of the new plane's wing spars, the monocule aluminum skin, the 4 Browning machine guns inside each wing, and the 80,000 rivets holding it all together. And the engineer knows by heart precise reasons why the revolutionary elliptical wings means a pronounced advantage in aerial combat, should the rumored war in Europe ever take place. But right now, it is enough for a solitary Reginald Joseph Reg Mitchell to set details aside and simply watch the fuselage number K5054 fly. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, And what a warrior she is, arguably the most nimble aircraft to ever take flight. A fighter aircraft's primary role is to attack other planes, and K5054 appears quite prepared to do just that. But I.J. Mitchell knows she is still a far cry from the airborne killing machine he promised Britain's air ministry. There is still much work to do, end quote. Dugard continues, quote, there are nuances to perfect before transitioning from prototype to mass production. The piston-driven engine tends to stall in a steep dive. The fuel tank's forward position represents a fire risk to the pilot. 20 millimeter cannon might be a better choice than 50 caliber guns, and so on. Mitchell will find his answer by questioning test pilot Jeffrey Quill about today's performance as he lands, then retreating into his office at Supermarine. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, yet design changes trouble Mitchell for less than the name his corporate bosses are giving the new creation. Mitchell prefers the shrew. Shrews are mammalian killing machines, some of the most ferocious predators on Earth. No matter. Supermarine's sobriquet is infinitely more evocative. Spitfire. It's what Supermarine Sir Robert McLean calls his daughter, and Reg Miller loathes the name. End quote. Modern, sleek, vastly superior to any other aircraft that currently existed, including the Hawker Hurricane. And it's often sort of been debated since then whether or not the Spitfire was the superior aircraft or the Hurricane. And the Hurricane is often considered the workhorse of the RAF because there was more of them and because they were more generally available and reliable. And certainly it has its appeal in pop culture and in our modern contemporary time. But during the 1930s and 1940s, it became the most sought after fighter for RAF flyboys and was revered by Luftwaffe pilots when they were engaged head to head against them. But it isn't just the fighter that would ultimately win the Battle of Britain. It was also a series of complex and sophisticated technological marvels that would assist these fighters in their mission to get into the skies and take the fight to the Germans. And it is that great invention that ultimately helped the British, not only during the Battle of Britain, but throughout the entire war, be victorious. And Martin Dugard has a very apt and concise description of just what exactly this contraption was that was utilized to great success during the Battle of Britain, when he writes, quote, the downing system begins with advanced warning. Coastal radio direction finding towers pick up enemy bombers and fighters and flash their position, strength, height, and estimated direction back to Fighter Command in Bentley Priory. Coastal watchers using binoculars confirm the attack to Fighter Command, adding precise numbers and heading. Fighter Command Headquarters filters this information in the filter room. The centerpiece is an enormous table map showing Britain and its coastal approaches. Filterers, specially trained to process raw data, have 2 minutes to triangulate current location, number of enemy aircraft, altitude, and anticipated target. One filterer for each RDF tower. Even a few seconds more will cost pilots precious time in advancing toward the enemy and climbing to a fighting altitude. Aerial combat is chess on a multidimensional blueboard, sprawling dozens of miles to the left and right, 6 miles up and down, and every angle in between. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, yet the filterer's decision must not be rushed. Poor filtering means German bombers might be flying in a completely different direction and not be found at all when a clear blue sky flying day becomes a maze of clouds, haze, blinding sunshine, and lighting refraction caused by dense layers of cold air forming above the warmer surface of the English Channel. So it is that the filterer makes furious mental calculations with the clock ticking, then tells the teller, who tells the operations room in each group and sector, which scramble fighter pilots who take to the skies and shout, tally ho. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, the doubting system ends with fighters, 3 squadrons per airbase. Each squadron numbers 12 aircraft, split into 2 flights of 6, A flight and B flight, which then branch into 2 formations of 3 planes per coded by color: red, yellow, blue, and green. 1 flight at a time is launched. This is important. Scramble too many aircraft, Fighter Command runs the risk of losing all of its meager resources to one massive Luftwaffe raid. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, the doubting system divided Great Britain into 4 geographical air groups. Each group has its own operations room and map table. Each group is divided into sectors, centered around individual airfields. Each sector also has an operations room and map table. Information flows from Dowding's filter room to the group operations room down to the sector operations room. Information becomes orders. End quote. And this system, the Dowding system, was named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, and he commanded Fighter Command. And Fighter Command had the absolute and firm responsibility over the utilization and implementation of fighters, Hurricanes, and Spitfires, mostly. Of course, there were others, but those are the 2 primary fighter aircraft that Fighter Command oversaw. But it wasn't just fighters. As Dugard notes, there was coastal radio detection towers, there were filterers and rooms and tellers and all these different individuals who worked for Fighter Command and who made sure that, given the role they played, like a cog in the wheels of a machine, they would do their job to the letter and ensure that, should there be any problems, it was not they who caused them. And it is that interlocking system that was created that would be ultimately the decisive advantage when the time came for aircraft to meet in the skies above Great Britain. And as was noted, the system ends with fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes. But those fighters themselves are practically useless without pilots to man them, without a skilled and experienced leader in the cockpit. There would be absolutely no way for this system to have been successful. And in fact, during the Battle of Britain, there were almost 2,000 British aircraft against over 2,500 German aircraft. And clearly, though the Germans had the advantage with respect to fighter quantity superiority. It was the quality of the fighters and the pilots who flew them that was strongly in favor of the British. And Dugard notes a story of one of them. And the Royal Air Force at the time was not exclusive to just native born Britons. It accepted volunteers from all over and cultivated and created bonds to grow and expand its ranks throughout the Commonwealth. So, in many instances, there were pilots from Canada, from South Africa, and from Australia. And Dugard notes a story of one of those pilots who was from New Zealand and how, even though the Germans possessed a superiority in aircraft, it was pilots like this that cut down the advantage that Germany possessed and made it relatively net neutral, in that both sides, when it came to the aircraft conundrum, were on the same playing field. Dugard writes, quote, Flight Lieutenant Alan Deary looks down and sees the masses at Dunkirk, but is still too high to land. The beach seems to be on fire. He glides above the coast, slowly losing altitude, broken engine no longer functioning. Sliding open his canopy for a better view, he chooses a narrow Belgian beach miles north of the British position. Deary crabs in to land at the water's edge. His wheels touch down in the white foam and wet sand, sending a geyser of salt water up over the canopy. The sudden jolt from landing on the soft surface throws him forward in the cockpit. He strikes his head on the windscreen and jerks his shoulders hard against his safety harness. Blood pours from a gash over Deary's left eye as he climbs from the cockpit and drops down from the left wing onto the sand. Burning the Spitfire would be the right thing to do now, preventing it from falling into German hands. No need. The Spitfire, personalized with an emblem of Deary's home nation, bursts into flames just moments after he pushes himself up and out of the cockpit. Fire consumes the instrument panel and melts the fuselage. Sand and oil mingle with the blood on his face as the New Zealander stands and wonders about his options. The time is 5 a.m. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deary watches the Kiwi logo burn. He's somewhere in German-held territory between Dunkirk and Ostend, and determined to get back to 54. End quote. So the end there, 54, that indicates Group 54, which Deary was a member of, and that was stationed at RAF Hornchurch. And this particular section, at least the group itself, had 8 serviceable aircraft on May 28, 1940, which was the second day of Operation Dynamo, which, as is probably evident, this passage was describing. And you see here, he was from New Zealand, which is an entirely different world from the one he finds himself in. He's alone, he's isolated, and yet his one sole thought is to get back to his group, to get into another cockpit and to take to the skies once again against the Germans. And it is that spirit, that determination, and that, you could say, lyric adventurism that resides within all Australians and New Zealanders from down under that would spread throughout the ranks of the RAF. And indeed, he was able to get back, and he would be shot down 6 more times throughout the Battle of Britain, but he would chalk up 22 confirmed kills. So again, if the Germans had 650 more aircraft, in just one instance, Deary that is, he was able to shoot down 3 aircraft for every time he was shot down. And it's men like that, pilots who have the attitude and the wherewithal and the, I guess, sort of boyish enthusiasm to want to continue taking to the skies, that would ultimately be part of the reason that the RAF would be successful during the Battle of Britain. And of course, the heroics of Deary was such that eventually, later on, when he did chalk up those kills, he got the letters AL written on the fuselage of his Spitfire. Those, of course, being the first 2 letters of his first name. So they took pride in the task that they were given. They certainly were committed to the task, no doubt about that, and they wanted to see it through. They were determined. And of course, his interaction occurred before the Battle of Britain really began. And as mentioned, it began in July of 1940. And once it did begin, that was when Fighter Command was able to put all of the pieces of its very sophisticated and intricate machine into operation. The puzzle, as it were, would finally be able to be displayed. And there was one instance where this occurred, and it was actually Churchill himself who saw firsthand this sort of interplay between the different pieces of the doubting system act and operate. And Dugard notes the interaction between the Prime Minister, who was a very keen and ardent supporter of the Air Marshal, Hugh Dowding, and was also, as history knows, one of those individuals that could summon the English language in such a way that defies description. It's pure mastery how he's able to place events and put them into perspective and the way in which he's able to do so. And again, this is just one skirmish that occurred throughout the Battle of Britain, as observed by Churchill himself, who was there also with his wife. And of course, the relationship between Winston Churchill and his wife being Clementine, was one that was certainly the most interesting, intriguing, and the talk of London and certainly world high society throughout his tenure as a leader. And Dugard writes, quote, Churchill has been here several times before. The small chamber is 2 stories tall. Filterers and plotters surround the large map table. Churchill counts 20 of them, some wearing telephone headsets hung around the neck. Others use the lull to knit or read. An enormous blackboard covers the wall. And this is him quoting Churchill now, quote, divided into 6 columns with electric bulbs for the 6 fighter stations, each of their squadrons having a sub-column of its own and also divided by lateral lines. Thus, the lowest row of bulbs showed, as they were lighted, the squadron that were standing by at 2 minutes' notice. End quote. Churchill will write. The Prime Minister thinks quite highly of 11 Group and their commander, quote, on which our fate largely depended. From the beginning of Dunkirk, all the daylight actions in the south of England had already been conducted by him, and all his arrangements and apparatus had been brought to the highest perfection. End quote. Dugard ends here and then continues with, quote, the primary responsibility of Group 11 is London, but the 25 squadrons under Vice Air Marshal Keith Park's command cover all of southeast England. This is the second step in the Downing system, one notch removed from fighter command. Just as at Bentley Priory, those lighted bulbs also show which squadrons are in readiness and available. There are also red lights for those aircraft who report seeing the enemy in the distance, those currently fighting, and those flying back to base. Calm before the storm. End quote. Dugard continues, quote, in the bunker, a spellbound Winston Churchill watches the big map as reports show bombers again approaching Dover, due to cross the coast between 2:14 and 2:20 in the afternoon. Squadrons from 10, 11, and 12 groups are scrambled between 2 and 2:15 to meet them. Quoting Churchill now, quote, a subdued hum arose from the floor, where the busy plotters pushed their discs to and fro in accordance with the swiftly changing situation. End quote. Churchill will write. These are not normal German raids. By every appearance, the Luftwaffe is throwing every available aircraft into the bombing of London. In fact, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, who was the commander of the Luftwaffe, is personally directing the action from Boulogne, just across the channel. The vainglorious Goering is desperate to keep his promise to Hitler, insists that the Battle of Britain will be won today. In the underground command post, Winston Churchill watches pensively as Park personally takes control of the situation. Quote, the Air Marshal himself walked up and down behind, watching with vigilant eye every move in the game, supervising his junior executive hand, and only occasionally intervening with some decisive order, usually to enforce a threatened area. I became conscious of the anxiety of the commander, who now stood behind his subordinate's chair. Hitherto I watched in silence. I now asked, what other reserves have we? Park had no choice but to answer, there are none. End quote, end quote. So it's clear that you have a combination of the high stakes, that being the continuation of Great Britain as an entity and as a nation, the anxiety, the filterers, the individuals who were working as plotters at the table, and those who wore the radio headsets. And then also the sophisticated yet significant doubting system on display before the eyes of probably the one person who you want to see it succeed. If it fails, you certainly don't want Winston Churchill there, because he'll write about it. But if it succeeds, not only do you want him there to write about it, but you want him there to witness it, to see it, and then to give his approval for the continuation of the doubting system. And of course, this was at a point in the Battle of Britain where, as the author mentions, Goering was getting more and more desperate, because he had said the Luftwaffe will be able to clear the skies of the RAF, and there's not a worry in the world that the Germans should have. And using the past as a prologue of sorts, and just looking at it from a numerically superior point of view, it would make sense that Goering boasted as he did. Of course, he was famous for boasts, but in this particular case, he had reason to do so. But as each day continued, as July went into August, and as August went into September, it got to the point where his sycophancy towards Hitler and his need to satisfy the word that he pledged to the Fuhrer made him not only take personal control, but do so in a way that probably hindered the ultimate effectiveness of the Luftwaffe. And that began a shift in the German strategy from targeting airfields and air bases such as Deary's Hornchurch to going after civilians in large cities to effectively target and carpet bomb areas with innocent individuals in them. And this strategy of morale bombing or terror bombing was dubbed the Blitz. And one of those individuals who observed the effects of the Blitz as sort of a tangent to the overall Battle of Britain itself was the famous CBS newsman Edward Murrow, who, because of his reporting during the Battle of Britain and during the Blitz, he was able to enter into media lore and legend. Now, obviously, today, the media is sort of a taboo subject given the rise of fake news as well as independent journalism through blogs and Substack and social media. But at the time, Murrow was really the gold standard. He was the precursor to Cronkite, who, for those who don't know, was the epitome of what a news person should be: independent, fully objective, with no agenda or side to choose. And Murrow was in London as this was occurring, as the Battle of Britain was being waged above him. And he is quoted by Dugard describing what it was like to live, in his case, as a civilian non-combatant while the Battle of Britain was being fought. Quote, "This is London. An air raid siren, calling Weeping Willie by the men who tend it, began its uneven screaming. Down on the coast, the white puffballs of anti-aircraft fire begin to appear against the steel blue sky. The first flight of German bombers was crossing up the river to start the 12-hour attack on London. They were high and not very numerous. The Hurricanes and Spitfires were already in the air. The German bombers, flying in V formation, began pouring in. It was like a shuttle service, the way the German planes came up the Thames River, the fires acting as a flare path. Often, they were above the smoke. The searchlights bored into that black roof but couldn't penetrate it. They looked like long pillars supporting a black canopy. The shrapnel clicked as it hit the concrete road nearby, and still the German bombers came. Today, I went to buy a hat. My favorite shop had gone, blown to bits. The windows of my favorite shoe store were blown out. I decided to have a haircut. The windows of the barber shop were gone, but the Italian barber was still doing business. The sundown scene in London can never be forgotten, the time when people pick up their beds and walk to the shelter. Good night and good luck. End quote. So this was on September 8th, 1940. And this occurred the second day of the German Blitz. It had begun the day before. And it would eventually last 8 months. And the most destructive period was between September and December 1940. And upwards of 40,000 British civilians were ultimately killed. But as Murrow notes, in a rather matter-of-fact way, the tense emotions that arise from being subjected to constant bombing and under the threat of a specter in which it does not announce ahead of time when it is going to appear and try and strike, was certainly something that was scary. And I can only imagine, speaking for myself, what it would be like if here in the United States there was something similar. Air raid sirens, the need to run to a shelter, hearing the fighting going on above, as well as the ground defenses doing what they could to contribute to that. But there's an interesting sort of caveat to all this, and Murrow, I think, hits the head on it, which was this idea of British pluck. The concept of keep calm and carry on. And I think that's personified in the Italian barber, who, even though his windows were completely destroyed and he was, well, by right, in a position where maybe he just would give up hope, he was still doing business. And that mentality of having a stiff upper lip, steel reserve, resolved, and to press on with all possible dispatch is a stereotype in every sense of the word of the British people. But in this case, it is certainly accurate and a positive stereotype that is often a characteristic attribute that Britons possess. And that term, keep calm and carry on, that was developed and created in 1939 in order to buck up the morale of the British people as they were under the threat of invasion. So for them to be attacked, to be mercilessly bombed, to have their entire world destroyed around them, and yet to still go about their daily life, to still conduct business, to live their life according to how they want to, was most likely the reason why, in the end, Britain survived not only the Battle of Britain or the Blitz, but the war itself. The people were determined. They had a strength of mind, body, and soul with the sole focus of winning against their adversary, an adversary who had begun to strike civilian targets and had now, in many ways, lived up to that barbaric connotation coined during World War I, that of the German Hun. And that then leads into the second book, The Secret Life of Fighter Command by Sinclair McKay. And this, while similar to Taking London, gives a more specific and nuanced look at the everyday life and interactions that would occur within Fighter Command itself, basically giving a direct and overarching history of what exactly Fighter Command did in order to contribute to the victory that was the Battle of Britain. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939. And the author writes that there was, in this battle, a contingent of pilots who came from Eastern Europe and Poland, who by July of 1940 were under subjugation of either Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, or both. And McKay talks about how they found their way to the island of Britain and ultimately placed themselves in the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Quote, "The fall of France had brought expert exiles, Polish airmen, among whom were some who had tried, with very limited numbers of planes, to hold off the German invasion of September 1939." End quote. McKay continues, quote, "After Poland had been brutally overrun, many pilots had decided to continue the fight by traveling, often by circuitous and hazardous routes, to France. As the Germans then swept through the Low Countries and across the Maginot Line, the Polish flew and fought bravely, though again in planes that had little of the nimbleness or versatility of British fighters. And now, in that moment of summer when Britain was caught in breathless suspension, a squadron of Polish pilots was formed, first coalescing in Blackpool, commanded by a British squadron leader, Ronald Kellett, together with Canadian Flight Lieutenant John Kent. 303 Squadron was pulled together with some fine Polish air veterans. End quote. McKay continues, quote, "The Polish pirates had seen their country, their communities, and their families fall under the shadow of both German and Soviet subjugation. Many had fought their way through an increasingly unstable Eastern Europe in their efforts to get to France and then to Britain. Their desire for vengeance was volcanic. There was a great many Canadian and Australian pilots too, and among them some Americans. Officially, since the USA was a very long way from joining the war, these men had no business or right to be flying with the Royal Air Force. Numbers can therefore only be a guess. The RAF itself has identified 11 American pilots who flew and fought in that summer of 1940, but there might well have been many more. Some crossed the border from America into Canada and signed up with the Air Force there." End quote. As mentioned before, the RAF wasn't just a single ethnicity employer, it was an equal opportunity employer. It was willing to take anyone from anywhere who had the right chutzpah and the inclination toward liberty, and that was willing to put themselves in a position to duke it out in the skies above against the Luftwaffe, who to that point had been undefeated. In Poland, in the Netherlands, where they systematically destroyed the city of Rotterdam, and of course, during the Battle of France. And it's interesting that the Poles, who at that point were strangers without a nation, were so willing and eager to get back into the fight that they traveled all these many miles. In some cases, it could very well have been thousands of miles, had already seen their fair share of death, destruction, and dreary misery, and yet decided that the best course of action was to suit up and get behind the stick of an aircraft that had the capability to bring about retribution upon their enemy. And I think it's that Polish sort of desire for freedom and independence, how they best believe it, that sustained the Polish resistance movement, not just during World War II, but throughout the entirety of its late 20th century existence. Of course, after Nazi Germany was defeated, the Soviet Union installed its own form of tyrannical dictatorship that governed Poland, and they were, as a result, forced to endure what was over a half century of tyranny, hate, and oppression. And again, as mentioned, they were excellent fighter pilots. They were determined, they were skilled, and they complemented very well the RAF, which included, again, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders such as Deary, and of course, the um, Flight Lieutenant John Kent, who was one of the commanders of 303 Squadron. He himself was Canadian. And then you have the 11 Americans. And it's interesting that Americans who, again, by this time, there was very strong isolationist sentiments. This idea of, yeah, we would like to help the Allies. We want to be there for the British and the French. But we also don't want to get involved like we did in World War I, because even though the United States had fought in World War I for about a year, we'll say. I mean, of course, there was, assistance and aid that was given throughout. Even though they served for that time period, which was short, they still sustained anywhere from 200 to 300,000 casualties. And for a nation at the time, which had only 60 years prior, not even, found itself in a civil war, it was a difficult pill to swallow, especially when the war really had nothing to do with the United States. Of course, you had the notions of safe for democracy and having the 14 points as articulated by President Woodrow Wilson, but it was really a European affair, predominantly. Civil War was an American affair, entirely. So the casualties are understandable in that context, but to fight overseas and lose 300,000 men, and not just lose in the sense of being killed, but through wounds, through psychological trauma, those lives would never be restored to their original state before they signed up and decided to go about fighting against Germany. So it's interesting that there was still sentiment, and strong enough sentiment, for at least 11 Americans to go and to fight on the side of the British. And of course, that really is the essence of what Fighter Command was. Volunteers who were sort of enthusiastic and full of vigor and youth that decided to join up and get their wings, get into a cockpit, and take to the skies. It was sort of a romantic view, like how there were back in history, you had the, knights on one side battling the barbarian horde on the other. Again, that's sort of the romantic view and certainly not an accurate one. But that concept applied in the minds of a lot of the men who became flyboys. And yet, much like how the Americans had that same youthful optimism entering World War One, not knowing quite what they were going to experience, they were quickly disillusioned by what the reality was. And McKay offers a rather interesting insight into what exactly such combat and such stress and such exertion that an individual had to produce in order to survive. Forget winning or losing, just to survive. He's able to really give a good, poignant, and concise description. And he writes, quote, "There is a photograph from the time, utterly arresting and haunting. It simply shows a young fighter pilot curled up in an armchair by a fireplace in an officer's mess. He is in full uniform, clearly ready to fly, and he appears to be asleep, his leg over the side of the chair and his hand near his mouth, giving an initially disconcerting impression that he is sucking his thumb. It is, though, equally disconcerting how very young this man looks. There is an extraordinary innocence and youth about the way that he is arranged in the chair. And we also get the impression that he is not sleeping at all, that his eyes are shut and relaxation is being feigned because if they weren't, then he would be pacing up and down furiously, racked with tension. This is a portrait of a boy who will shortly be required to vault into the heavens, piloting complex machinery and facing savage jeopardy. You cannot help thinking to yourself, what if that had been you at the age of 18? End quote. And I think that the ending of that passage really hits home that point that if you were 18, 19 years old, or even 20, which is just 1 year removed from being a teenager, how would you act? Would you be ready and eager to volunteer? Would you be cold via a draft of some kind? Would you try to avoid combat altogether? And then once you got into it, if you did, what would that do to you? Would you enjoy it? Would you find satisfaction? Would you feel that you're fighting for the side that's on the Angels? Or would you feel maybe like this young pilot, exhausted, stressed, no doubt worried and fearful of the future, and apprehensive of his fate? Because when the planes would go up into the sky, there was a high percentage chance that they all wouldn't return. And of course, you had men like Deary who shot down 7 times. They would ultimately just bail out, parachute down, pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and walk back to wherever their squadron was. But you'd also have men that would not be able to come back. And they would have, frankly, if you were to ask any of the pilots at the time, they would have it easy because the survivors would have to have it on their minds that they lost a buddy, some guy who they shared, you know, biscuits and tea with that morning, who didn't return. Now they thought, well, that could be me next. You know, old Johnny got it, so my time is certainly coming. I'm about to punch the ticket, and then that's it. And to be in that continued state of just anxiety, fear, thrown into the abyss of the unknown, it does a lot to somebody's psyche. And of course, that's only heightened once you get into the cockpit itself and once you're up in the skies. And it's it's a testament to those who flew on both sides. I think it's worth noting because it was dangerous to both. It wasn't like, just for the British. It was this monumental and gargantuan task, and it was only they who felt the strain. No, of course, the Germans and the Italians as well, because the Italians fought as well with the Luftwaffe. They certainly felt the strain, and they felt the terror and the anxiety, but they also had positive reinforcement from the fact that they had not lost. They had, in their mind, the best and most sophisticated war machine on earth, and they were looking to continue to subjugate lands that they thought ought to be theirs. Now, of course, the individual pilot or mechanic maybe didn't think that way, but they certainly were proud of the achievements thus far. The only thing the British and Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Poles, and Americans had to fall back on was the fact that they were fighting for abstract ideas: liberty, freedom, democracy, and also the tangible, which was Great Britain itself, British Isles. So when those two forces met in the air, it is only really something that can be experienced if you yourself were there. And this is true with combat in general. You really have to be there to experience it. But there's a passage that McKay talks about, and he documents what it was like for British and German pilots to actually square off in the skies above, which were at that time battlefields. And those were really the most tense battlefields that would exist in or around Britain throughout the entirety of World War II. You could argue the U-boat war and the clash between the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine, but in terms of the intensity and the ferocity in the span in which it occurred, no doubt the fighting that occurred in the skies was the most deadly in the entire war for the British home islands. And McKay notes that when he writes, quote, "The apparent discipline of the huge German formations, the fighters ringing the bombers, was reduced during air battles to a frenzy of chaos. The British fighter pilots swooped, and all was a kind of factual confusion. The Spitfire pilots would see with icy satisfaction the flames erupting near the tails of the Junkers or Messerschmitts, German bombers and fighters respectively. Sometimes they saw worse: German pilots in stricken planes, trapped and panicking in their cockpits, or even jammed halfway in and out, unable to budge as their planes plunged inexorably. Then there was the surge of adrenaline when they themselves were hit. Sometimes cockpits would erupt in flames, and pilots, in the effort to ready themselves to bail out, would suffer hideous burns to their hands and their faces. They would then have to plunge these burns into the salt sea below. There were injuries that, if survived, would change lives, and the popular imagination now began to be haunted by the image of mutilated young pilots, and their chances of leading normal lives, dances, romances, courtship, marriage, sex, outside of the war. The public understood very well the potential horrors that each pilot faced every day. The truly astonishing feat is how the pilots, both British and German, learned to overcome the disorientation of these fast, fluid aerial battles. The split-second moment of seeing the enemy emerging from the bright sunshine, the climbs and dives to evade fire, the whirling, twirling prospect as one pilot chased another across the sky, trying to keep him in his sights. Training only went so far. End quote. It's it's described so well as almost this. It's like if you were to take NASCAR and jousting, put them together, and then you enabled that image that I just created to float and have the ability to defy the laws of gravity and be up in the sky. The fastness, the sleekness, but also the notion of this one-on-one matchup. Because of course you had formations and you had fighters and bombers and multiple planes, but it really came down to the one-on-one individual battles between the pilots and the feeling in the cockpit. How when it came time, all the fastness, all the speed, all the maneuverability, all the flexibility, that was all, I guess, second fiddle to when it was a head-to-head matchup, one-on-one between the fighter pilots themselves, or between a fighter and a bomber, but that was a little less high stakes. And what I mean by that is a bomber is a little less maneuverable, a little less flexible. Of course, there's, you know, outliers. This is certainly the norm. But by and large, the fighters were much more maneuverable, much more sleek, much faster. And as a result, they were the manifestation of that idea that I just conjured up, the NASCAR jousting. The speed, but also the uncertainty as to whether or not you were going to come through unscathed when it was a 1v1 matchup. And it was instances like that, split second, quick, as soon as it was here and then it was there. It began and then ended almost in the blink of an eye. That began to cause a rather piling burden upon the shoulders of those men who had to take to the skies. And of course, that burden was shared by mechanics and cooks and clerks and others who were part of Fighter Command, who I think rather unfairly do not get the attention that they so rightly deserved. Certainly, they didn't now and then. But that's also because we as humans like the intensity, the ferocity, the deadly lethality that comes with those who are at the sharp end of the bayonet. Whether that be infantrymen, fighter pilots, bomber pilots, submarine commanders, paratroopers, people who found themselves in constant combat. And it's a shame, really, that that does not get the same attention and focus as the fighter pilots themselves. Yet, by the same token, the fighter pilots are the ones who put their lives on the line, whereas the mechanics and the cooks and the clerks, they really don't have to do the same feats as the pilots. And there's something to be said about that. But by and large, if there's any recognition or praise or thanks that should be given, it should be given to the entirety of Fighter Command. Pilots, clerks, cooks, the mechanics. And it's because those pilots were the ones who were on the precipice, tip of the spear, sharp end of the bayonet, that they found themselves, like the earlier passage, being in a constant state of near exhaustion. And that photograph of the pilot who's sitting in this sort of daze, was one, no doubt, that could easily be replicated and pointed to as an example that was constant throughout Fighter Command. And it could be said that that notion was one that was shared on both sides of the channel. And McKay writes about that fact and how it was that Fighter Command would go about their daily routine when they were not suiting up for battle. And he writes, quote, "Life for the British fighter pilots was taking on a curious dualism. The familiarity of the base and all the faces there, the comforts of tea, cocoa, corned beef sandwiches, the cool green grass beneath one's feet, and then the life above, a life of daily, unthinkable stress requiring from dawn until sunset, unceasing alertness, coupled with the ability to blank out the huge discomforts of G-force, of unheated cockpits, of the noise of engines and guns. To fly alone for so many hours a day would be exhausting enough by itself. But add to that the furious concentration, plus the effort to keep mind-paralyzing fear at bay, and a quite different order of mental control and willpower was required. Because, of course, bravery is not about being frightened. Only a fool or robot would not be frightened, but the ability, somehow, to compartmentalize the fear and indeed the fatigue, shut them away in another room, as for the third or fourth time that day, you don parachute and strap yourself into your cockpit, ready once more to try and shoot men down in flames before they succeed in killing you." End quote. So they knew the score, they knew what they were getting into, and they saw sort of that vision. It was kill or be killed. It was primitive survival instincts combined with modern technology. And I think McKay really hits the head of the nail here, spot on, when he says the ability to take the fear, take the anxiety, take all those feelings that you have, suppress them deep down inside of you, and then just continue to keep going and going and going. That requires a lot of skill. And it's skill you really can't teach. You kind of have to learn that on the job. And if you don't, then you don't possess that skill. And it, again, ties back to that photograph of that pilot. How would you fare in that situation? Would you be able to cram those thoughts deep down inside of you and forget about losing your friend, getting shot down yourself, seeing an enemy pilot who you have no real love lost for, but you have a respect towards, burn up in their cockpit? To take all those thoughts, suppress them, get your parachute on, get back into the cockpit, and maybe be one of those things that you're trying so hard to suppress, how would you fare? It's worth asking, because this was a legitimate thought at the time, and there was legitimate men who were willing, in every sense, to take up the mantle. And when the call went out, whom shall we send? They stepped forward and said, "Send me." And I think that notion of volunteering, of putting your life on the line, of being the ones to step up and make a difference, was certainly not lost on the everyday British civilians whose protection and safety they were the guarantees of. It was certainly not lost on the leaders, especially Winston Churchill, who saw this battle unfolding before his eyes, his first real test of command and control leadership as prime minister. You could argue Operation Dynamo was, but that didn't involve the very survival of the nation that he led. The Battle of Britain certainly did. And Churchill was appreciative certainly during and after the Battle of Britain, of those airmen. But also, even beforehand, he was able to see with his own eyes what it was that the Flyboys had the potential to do. And that was, as he so poignantly described on June 5th, 1940, as being the defenders of a way of life that was under siege and was threatened with extinction. And he writes, or rather, he spoke what he wrote, as quoted by McKay, saying, quote, "May it not be that the cause of civilization will be defended by the skill and devotion of a few thousand airmen. There never has been, I suppose, in all the world, in all the history of war, such an opportunity for the youth. The Knights of the Round Table, the Crusaders, all fall back into the past, not only distant, but prosaic. These young men, going forth every morn to guide their native land, and all that we stand for, holding in their hands these instruments of colossal and shattering power, of whom it may be said that every morn brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble knight, deserve our gratitude." End quote. Again, you see Churchill really able to take something as, I don't want to say insignificant, because it certainly is important. I mean, after all, this is what this entire episode is about, but something as, I guess, simple and straightforward as fighter pilots and airmen, and is able to weave it into a narrative that combines history, philosophy, concepts of civilization and defending one's home into a few short sentences. And mindful, that last quote came from Alfred Lloyd Tennyson's Idylls of the King. So he's able to use this mastery of the human language, especially the English word that he possesses, to compare the dogfighting in pilots to jousting in knights, which I'd mentioned earlier with the NASCAR jousting. And his words that he speaks is praise from the highest level on behalf of the many toward the few. And he even is famously quoted um, as saying, you know, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. That, which ultimately he said to honor the RAF during the Battle of Britain, that was prerequisited by this statement. Because again, the Battle of Britain wouldn't begin until July. And on June 5th, he was already describing what was coming. He saw it. He was a visionary in that sense that he was able to pinpoint what was coming down the pike. And he was able to put it in such lofty phrases that indeed rightly summed up the situation, because, after all, the Battle of Britain saw 544 RAF pilots killed, which was 1 out of every 6 who got into their cockpits and went into the heavens. And in no metaphorical sense, they indeed ended up there. And I think that it is this idea of any people, anywhere in the world, having admiration, respect, and love for those very few who decide that it is their mission to do what others choose not to get little recognition for, but to do so in a way that ensures that they have, at the very least, a strong sense of self and a strong sense of purpose and knowing that they're making a difference. And it is those people, the few, whom the many ought to never forget and to constantly be appreciative, because if it were not for them, and you can look at this throughout any period in the history of mankind, if it were not for them, then there would be many of people throughout world history that would not have the ability to do what it is that they want to do in the best way that they can imagine it, and to live their life free of tyranny and oppression. And it certainly is not exclusive to any century or any specific country or peoples. It's omnipresent throughout humanity and throughout the history of the human race.